Alrighty, so thus QR coded and Wi-Fi'd up. I'm going to begin. I'm going to take you through signs of, if I can get this thing to work, stress. But before they do that, I thought it might be useful to provide a tiny bit of context. So this here is a definition taken from the World Health Organization, I believe, about mental health. I know we talk about mental health quite a lot these days, didn't used to 5 or 10 years ago. Mental health. And as this quote indicates, it's a state of well-being. Particularly in a sports club as we are, we're very well versed in physical well-being, but maybe less so in mental. And what I like about this, our little skull fella here with the sliding scale, is that it's not something that's static. It's dynamic. It can change and evolve and move, and does evolve all the time. So any of us at any point will be somewhere in here, today, tomorrow, in a month, in a year. And it moves around. And there are signs that I have learned that can help us understand perhaps where we are on that scale. And there are signs I had to learn. I wasn't aware of them. I wasn't educated as to what they might look like. But I have become so. As I'll talk about a little bit later, I did a mental health first aid training course, and I've taken some of the following information from that, but also some other resources, various charities. And I apologise for the amount of words and the tininess of the text on this slide, but there was no other way to fit it all in. Early warning signs. Fatigue, indigestion, headaches, changes in weight or appetite, joints and back pain, sleep patterns, tension, trembling, speech, pain in throat or chest, sweating, feeling cold. Some of the physical signs, and there are some that are more psychological, about how one feels. I won't read you out the whole list, but pick out one or two. Feeling a bit low, change in mood, not finding things funny anymore, difficulty relaxing, responding to experiences or things that you can't actually see. And then there are some behavioural ones that are a bit more obvious. So I would characterise some of the ones on the left as quite hard to spot to someone else looking in. Quite difficult to spot of yourself, but on the right there are some that if we know what we're looking out for, we might be able to identify and spot. And lots of these are to do with behaviour, how people are acting. Changes to things, drinking more or less than usual. Becoming angrier, quicker than usual. Working longer hours or more intensely. Taking time off sick, which you might dress up as having a cold or something else. And behavioural signs. And on the theory of time, remembering the guy with the image of the skull with the thing flicking around. Time's quite important because of that big long list that I showed you, there are loads of things in there that you could feel fleetingly and in the moment because of what's going on around you. So just because you feel it in a moment doesn't mean instantaneously that that's something to be deeply alarmed about. It might just be temporary. It might oscillate. Might change in intensity or frequency. Again, that in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean that there's a big problem to worry about. Unless we start seeing them here, continuously, ongoing, over an extended period of time. So that's when these signs could start to become more relevant. So why do I care about all this stuff? Why do I do this now? And here I'll tell a little bit of a story. 1991, who cares about that? Well, that's roughly when I left school and started working, started getting paid to do stuff. And that's, I suspect, is the point at which, actually it probably started at school to be fair, but that's really the point at which I started learning that you are expected to present and act and behave in a certain way in a professional context. And you pick those cues up from the people around you. So that's probably when I really started grasping the idea, I need to show up in a certain way whether I feel it or not. That is what's expected of me. And I largely continued in that vein for 30 years or so, until 2019. The significance of that will become apparent. So I'll give you some examples of showing up for stuff, wearing the apparel and the visage of somebody in a professional context. So this is several photos of me in 2019 doing stuff actually not massively dissimilar for this. Standing on a stage, presenting to a group. The group in question here would be at a trade conference or some such. There'd be a couple hundred people out there, and I'd be presenting the services of our company with, no doubt, lots of slides that I would have dressed up as thought leadership in some way, and clearly actually it's a sales deck that marketing have given me. And this is how I had learned to present what was expected of me. So what you won't see in any of these photos is how I actually felt about doing that work that day. You'd be seeing what I was choosing to show you and what I thought was expected of me. And it worked thoroughly well as far as I was concerned. Nobody doubted it or told me otherwise. So I was outwardly projecting what I wanted people to see, and would definitely not be projecting anything that I didn't want them to see, because I would have classified that as unprofessional. Very clear view on that. I came to feel about that projecting the clothes, the persona that I was wearing, a bit like a suit of armour that I could put on at the beginning of the day. I worked in a very high pressure sales environment where I felt under duress and under attack, so I put my armour on and that would keep me safe. And I used to think that's what resilient was. Keep me safe. Interestingly, my suit of armour did keep me safe, and every time I felt under a bit more duress, I'd upgrade it, and it would get stronger and more sophisticated and keep me even safer from difficult things going on around me. I came to learn later, for reasons I'll go into, that it was a two-way barrier. It didn't just keep me safe, it also stopped stuff coming out. So without getting too metaphorical about it, my suit of armour also was a cage. It prevented anything coming out too, and pressure built up within. So as I was pretending to be Iron Man, looking like that, ready for battle, what I actually looked like was more like Tony Stark, absolutely battered, about to get into some difficulties with some interstellar beings. That's what I largely felt like, but I would show the image of myself on the left. The timeline took us up to 2019, so we're just going to wind back a year into 2018. And here I'm in my old job, wearing my suit of armour, upgrading it as per usual. I'm in a boardroom with my boss and a respected colleague, and we're doing some strategy work on a whiteboard, very exciting, how to sell more units of the stuff that we sold. Doing quite well, actually, having some good fun. And then out of nowhere, I felt a bit odd, felt a bit weird, which moved quite quickly into, I feel really, really unwell, which turned into me leaning on the wall as I am now, which turned into me sliding down the wall. And in a matter of seconds, found myself not kneeling in a superhero pose, that's for sure, but lying on my back on the floor in the boardroom, feeling some of the symptoms on an earlier slide. Pain in my chest, elevated heart rate, felt nauseous, lightheaded, bit disconnected from what was going on. My colleagues said, "Are you all right?" And I responded in the way that I'd respond to all and any question in a professional context. I responded, "Fine, I'm fine. Carry on." I'm lying on my back with pain in my chest and down my arm, an elevated heart rate, feeling really faint. What I actually thought was, I wonder if this is what a heart attack feels like. I wonder if I'm going to die on the floor here. But instead of saying any of that, I projected out that which I wanted to be true, which was, I'm fine, carry on. Ridiculously, they actually did. But not for ages, but for a short while. Such was the force of the projection that I wanted it to be true, and they wanted to believe me. So they took my word for it as I was lying on the floor looking awful, and tried to carry on with the strategizing for a short while. And then common sense prevailed, and what they actually turned into was, I think we're going to get you to hospital, in fact. I think we're going to call an ambulance. At which point I became furious. He went, you're effing not doing that. I'll be fine in a minute. Sure enough, I was fine. Long story short, did eventually go to hospital, did get hooked up to ECGs and all the rest, did get asked loads of questions about how I was feeling. By the time I got there, I did feel much better. The intensity of that had subsided. So I was getting back into my comfortable skin of pretending it was fine and ignoring it. I later learned what had happened to me, but I spent a lot of time pretending it was something else and looking for an exotic and interesting ailment that I could take a pill to get rid of. So that happened. Middle of 2018. Let's skip forward less than a year into 2019. Interesting what you'll get used to over time. Interesting how these little changes that influence and affect become normal. Weren't before, but become normal as the water gently heated beneath me. And what's happening here, again at a trade show in March 2019, having done loads of touring around Europe and standing on stage and delivering thought leadership. A colleague went, "How are you?" I'm in a Wetherspoons in Tower Hill. "How are you?" I went, "Fine, thanks, terrific, brilliant." For reasons I'll never be totally clear on, she didn't believe me. She'd seen something past the facade and challenged me on it gently and went, "Are you sure? Because you don't look yourself. How are you really?" I accidentally told the truth, which was, "I'm not fine. This is too hard. I can't do it anymore." Which came as a surprise to me because, professionally speaking, that's the best I've ever been. That's the most I've ever made. I've never hit targets so relentlessly. So all the evidence I was looking at indicated that I definitely was fine. And yet here I am saying, it's too hard, I can't do it anymore. So I didn't finish the sentence. I got about as far as the F of fine. Instead of saying fine, I burst into tears. We're in a Wetherspoons. I've got my boss's boss, two senior colleagues, the most senior person in my team that reports to me. The entirety of the UK sales team sat next to us. And around us are 150 of our clients who've been at that trade show. So I don't know where I'd choose to have a breakdown, but in my imagination, it's not Wetherspoons. Nevertheless, that is what happened. That's why that graph finishes here. After, I might add, my most successful Q1 by a significant margin. Not only that, the most successful Q1 any team in any country in an organisation had ever had. So I'm at the absolute pinnacle, but here I am, finally confessing. I can't take it anymore. Wonder what happened. Oh, that's what was happening. I'd had a panic attack. I'd had a panic attack in 2018. If I go back far enough, I can actually find one or two other ones, much further back in my youth. But I wasn't looking, wasn't paying attention, didn't know what the signs were, so I misdiagnosed it as something else. Definitely felt like that was happening, because here I am, sobbing in a Wetherspoons, actually sobbing, can't speak, snot coming out, red face, losing control, feeling deeply afraid, embarrassed, amongst other things. And I can't stop, and that was the most frightening thing of all, not being able to stop. My whole thing was based on control previously, so that was scary, losing control. Definitely thought several times now I've been in a situation I think I might faint, blood pressure or whatever it is going on. Definitely thought that. Didn't think that in the Wetherspoons, funny enough, but did think it previously. So clearly for me there were different flavours of panic attack where some signs were stronger than others. And I did again wonder if, maybe this is what a heart attack feels like. Now these are personal to me. I'm not telling anybody else how anyone else's panic attack felt like, but that's what was happening to me. So just to be detailed about it, there's a number of things that are actually going on in a panic attack. This is not an exhaustive list, but there's quite a lot in there. And lots of that resonates. But in 2018, that resonated, and yet I wasn't equipped to recognise any of those things for what they really were. I was very busily finding it to be something else. Long story short, March 2019, I was then signed off sick from work. I then spent the entirety of 2019 not at work, signed off repeatedly, given some medication to take, eventually found some therapy, not at the first time of asking, I might add. Went through several therapists. Not that they were bad therapists, but as it turns out, the therapist for you isn't necessarily the first therapist that you meet. I had no experience of that either, so even that was quite difficult to learn to ask for help and then have to ask several times more. I'm going to zoom forwards a little bit. I'm going to take you to April 2021. So by now, been off work for 9 months or so, went back to work in a phased return that was suboptimal. I went back too soon to do a job that I wasn't well enough to do. Ended up being made redundant from that role. That's a whole story. Deeply painful. Funny enough, best thing for me, though, because I shouldn't have been there anymore. I didn't have the strength or the wisdom to know that. Anyway, one of the things that I did after that, other than becoming a coach, which I am now, retraining and finding a new purpose, was I decided that I would go ahead and do a mental health first aid course because I was beginning to advocate this sort of thing. And I felt I don't actually know what it is I'm advocating in any level of detail. So I'm going to put myself on a course, pay some money, go on a course. It'll be interesting. I'm curious. This is my workbook that I used in that course. And this is section 3 of the course, which deals with anxiety. And what's happening here is, as we're going through and the instructor is telling us different bits and pieces, I've taken my highlighter pen and I've highlighted all the bits that I felt off the page. By the end, I realised I've functionally highlighted the entire page of all of the symptoms of long-term anxiety and stress. Now I'm going to zoom you into the Goldberg Anxiety Scale, which exists on that page. It's a diagnostic tool. It's not a tool that you would use to get to a diagnosis, it's an indicator. It's a way of indicating whether further investigation should happen. So I'd gone through the Goldberg Anxiety Scale, and how it works is, if you are exhibiting and experiencing anything up to 4 on a fluctuating and temporary basis of the list I'm about to show you, it means probably absolutely nothing. Probably means you've just had a difficult week or day, or something stressful is going on in the moment. Anything 4 or 5, no problem. Anything above 4 or 5, 6 I think is the threshold, a clinician might go, let's ask a few more questions, let's dig a little deeper. And the more you exhibit for a continuous period of time, and it's a month or more continuously, by the way, then they're like, okay, we probably should dig into something properly here because there's probably something serious going on. Sorry, not serious necessarily. There's something going on that we should look at. So here's the list. There's 9 things on here. And as I went through it, pondering what it was that I'd been experiencing for a long period of time. And when I say long, tracing back now, I'm going back to 2015 probably. There or thereabouts, 4 or 5 years. Like the frog in the pot, not with maximum intensity right away. Tava.
Sorry, I know I'm not meant to put my hand up, but just wondering if you could give us an indication of how old you were when this was happening and how long you've been doing that job for, like, just to put it in some sort of time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was there for 10 years. So about 10 years. Well, I'm going to be 50 this year.
Okay, so how long had you been in that world, the sales world?
By then, more than 15 years, nearly 20 years in a high pressure sales type job. In that organisation, 5 years. So going back to 2015, where am I? I'm in my sort of early 40s. Conveniently, almost exactly where midlife crises start, apparently, in men, which is an interesting thing to ponder in and of itself, which we won't do right now. But it's a good question, thanks. And as we have just learned, you can stick your hand up anytime you want. 9. The only one I didn't have for a month or more, if not months, if not years, was being worried about my health. Weirdly, that's the aerobically fittest I've ever been when I had my breakdown. Cycling 100 miles a week at least, commuting to work, playing rugby, not at this site, but at the old one, occasionally, to a very mediocre standard, but playing competitive squash, doing the occasional triathlon, and doing some wall climbing and stuff. I'm doing a ton of exercise. So I'm physically extremely fit and strong anyway, not least for a person of my age at that time. So I'm not at all worried about my health. But everything else on this I'm exhibiting near constantly. In particular for me, difficulty falling asleep. I'd never get to sleep before about 2 a.m, having read for 2 hours or so. My wife, Izzy, goes to sleep no matter what, like she's been shot by a tranquilizer. It's deeply irritating. Head down, that's it. It's about 10 seconds. And I'd roll around for a couple of hours. I would then wake up every 90 minutes, every night, with things spinning around my head. Quite often, absolutely soaking wet. Haven't wet the bed. Well, actually, I had wet the bed, but through night sweats. So the tension was coming out in perspiration. So I'd wake up absolutely soaking, such that I'd have to literally towel myself off, dry off for a bit, put towel on the sheets, go back to sleep. Frog in a pot. That became normal. So I thought nothing of it. So I wonder how we could translate some of this information I'm sharing at quite pace with you and try and distill it down into a couple of things. It's going to be a bit worky now, thinking in a professional context. So actually, without too much effort, you can apply it socially too. It goes back to change in a pattern, different from the norm that you expect of that individual. About deadlines or concentration, they're acting differently and constantly. Might be working much longer or much shorter than usual. Work-life balance, funnily enough, self-care is one of the first things to go when we're busy. I haven't got time for that. That's not important enough, so I'm just going to bin that off to do more work. Self-care goes real quick, becoming a bit chaotic. You could translate some of this stuff into socially. Formerly punctual people are now suddenly late, routinely arriving in a bit of chaos. Oh, I'm so sorry, I've got so much going on. Change in behaviour, not so interested in stuff as they used to be, more tired than they used to be. Not turning up for things that they used to turn up for. In a hybrid working environment, people who formerly were camera on and would have a chat about what they're up to at the weekend suddenly don't do that anymore. It's a change in a pattern. Drinking more or less, exercising more or less, smoking more or less. It's a bit of a difficult one, that, because many of us don't routinely drink at 7 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon in a rugby club in South West London, so I wouldn't read too much into some of these things. But in combination, they become interesting and important. More examples of the same theme, really, looking for patterns. So I'm wondering, as I ponder all of this, what was it that made it so difficult for me to admit it to myself? What was it that made it so hard to explore how I really was as opposed to how I was pretending to be? I quite like the snow, that's a picture of a snow globe. I quite like that as an illustration because looking back, that's what my head felt like a lot of the time, an agitated snow globe with all the things I was trying to manage and worry about swirling around in my head simultaneously. Really hard to grip onto one and focus on it. And that would have been, for me, absolutely typical of that period of work in that period of my life. And it would be made up of this sort of stuff. Some of this might be more relevant to you than others, but it's just about an enormous volume of things and activity and people vying, screaming, shouting for your attention at any one time. And it's really hard to sift through it. So that made it hard, because it's just too chaotic. And there were some barriers too. Barriers to overcome, to begin the conversation. And again, one of the barriers would be, I just haven't got the headspace, I haven't got the bandwidth to even step back long enough to even think about talking. Maybe it's about what's going on around me with the people that I'm working with. Maybe they're just in my ears and in my face too much for me to have the time. Maybe I'm just feeling really overwhelmed. Lots of barriers. A lot of that's a combination of internal and external, perhaps. So I'm thinking now, how and when and where could we have these conversations and with whom? So these are sort of rhetorical. Where could they happen? What would we talk about? How would we do it anyway? How would we initiate it? And when? They say there's a time and a place for everything, but when is the time and the place to have check-ins with one another about this stuff? Who would you do it with? And why would you bother? Why would you bother? I'll give you an example in a minute of, and I'm definitely not picking on anybody because it's what happens all the time and routinely what happened all the time before is you bump into people that you know and the first thing that you say is some version of, hey, how are you? And they go some version of, yeah, good, thanks. How are you? And you go, good, thanks. And thus ends the interaction because nobody's really asking the question and no one's listening to the answer because that's not what that was. It was just social etiquette playing out. Done it lots of times over here. So I wasn't trying to be obscure or obtuse when each of you individually have gone, how are you, how are you feeling? And I've gone, I'm fine at the moment. Because I try quite hard now to tell the difference between a real question and a not one and answer it properly. But it wasn't the time and the place to give you a long explanation about how I was feeling when you asked me over there. I will do that after if you want. So it's about something in a pattern, something about repetition, something that makes it hard for us to interrupt because it's just habit. And actually it's etiquette that we've been taught and it's polite to ask each other these questions. So this happens in nearly every interaction that we have, unless we decide to do it differently. So I'm going to suggest how, and someone can decide to do it. Just the insertion of, bearing in mind we know that someone's going to say, how are you? We know that you're going to say, fine, thanks, because you always do. So if you're really asking, just going in again and going, how are you really? They're like, oh, well, since you ask, blah. I said times have been tough, doesn't have to be tough necessarily, it can just be true, real, whatever it is. And what that's done is breaking the chain and it's set permission. I'm going to tell you who I actually am. Then I'm going to ask you how you actually are. And now we've found a time and a place. And unless we do that, we're not going to be capable of, even if we know what the signs are, if we're not looking, we're not going to see them. So this is just one of the ways that you can interrupt it. And for me, this is the critical element of that. If we were to do quizzes and if I was to drill you on what all the different signs were, you could learn what all the signs are. But it's really hard to see stuff if you're not looking. So it's not enough to know what some of the signs are. You have to choose to look. Then you might see them. So take the time to look. And since I've used conversation as a way to unpick signs, I've got a view on what an actual conversation looks like. And there's a couple of requirements. Ought to have some element of honesty in it, I think. And with that comes openness. I'm going to be honest, I'm going to be open about, if you're going to take the time to inquire as to how I really am, I ought to respond openly and honestly to you. Because if I do that, firstly, I'm demonstrating that I trust you with the answer. I'm trusting that you wanted to know and I trust you with the answer. And you'll get that back. That's not theoretical for me because that's one of the things I'm most grateful for that I've learned since melting down, burning out, breaking down in spectacular fashion. And there's lots of people in this room that I know quite well and there's some that I know less well. But what I can tell you is I've got back what I've given. I've shown some vulnerability and told the truth about some stuff. And what I had in return isn't generally ridicule or judgment. Generally, I've been trusted reciprocally with something quite important to them too. So we've built trust. Not saying we didn't have trust before, but a different kind of trust. And like my colleague did that day at the trade show, she trusted her intuition. I don't think she was sitting there processing what she thought she was seeing and connecting dots in her mind. I think she just felt, I'm not sure that you are. She just trusted her gut, just went for it. And she didn't take fine for an answer. Don't think you are fine. I'm going to go in again. I'm going to ask you again. How are you really? Because that person is perfectly allowed to decide still not to answer. You're not just go, but how are you really? No, I'm not taking it. I'm not leaving till you tell me. You're not going to do that, but at least go in again. You're indicating that you might want to know. So just expand that theme about talking and listening. If I was to ask you what's talking and what's listening, I'm sure you'll give me a totally coherent answer as to what that looks like. But I think that in today's busy world, we're possibly missing a bit of a nuance about talking and listening, which is not the same as broadcasting and cursorily paying attention. Turning my face to where the noise is coming from is not the same as listening to what I'm being told. It's to give attention to what I'm being told. And it's where things are exchanged. That reciprocity that I was talking about before. And there's an acronym, this is going to be an acronym in a minute, which has helped me enormously to get better at the listening part. Whereas before, I'd jump right into problem-solving mode. I've inquired as to something, someone's played a scenario to me, and I previously would have listened only long enough to grasp the theme. Then I would have done a bit of a recognition of, I've seen this before. I know what the rest of the problem is. So I'm not going to wait for you to finish. What I'm basically going to do is wait for you to stop talking, to inhale. I'm going to use that as my opportunity to interrupt you and offer you the solution that you haven't asked me for, based on my limited understanding of what you're trying to say. Mightn't even have asked for a solution, and in lots of cases, funnily enough, they haven't. And I don't know about you, but a number of times in my life, less so now, but previously, well-meaning sentences that started with, why don't you just, have been offered to me as I've articulated an issue. Why don't you just do this incredibly simple thing? And my response to that is to actually be immediately annoyed and defensive. I didn't ask for your solution, and I certainly didn't ask for a trivialised version of it. It came from a place of love, funnily enough. Not funnily enough, came from a place of love. Why don't you just do this? I've heard you've got a problem. I'd like to solve it, because I thought that's what this was. And it isn't. It is at work a lot of the time, but often it isn't that at work too. We should just shut up for a bit. So I've used this acronym a lot to help me with that, because I, like everybody else, a bit of a problem solver, and you don't want to see people in difficulty. So you want to intervene as quickly as you can to take the pain away, take the difficulty away, make it easier. So I ask myself routinely now, wait, if I've asked them how they are, why am I talking? It's their turn. My job was to ask and give attention, not to jump in and solve, unless they've asked me to, which is different. So let's imagine for a moment, we've taken the time, we've given our attention, we've used our gut, we think we've spotted a sign or two, and we don't have to be certain. Let's imagine that somebody does come back and starts to play something back out. So to expand on the problem-solving instinct, I've had tons of excellent advice from friends and family over the last few years. I've also had tons of really crap advice too, which was inappropriately delivered and inappropriate. Not because they're foolish or silly, but not qualified. Not qualified to give advice on complex problems. I like this less as an acronym, because algae's spelt differently. So there's something in me that find that a little bit annoying. But anyway, part of mental health first aid training is to largely, what's your role, kind of? Well, it's to care enough to ask. It's to listen to what somebody says to you, try and suspend your judgment and solutioneering instincts. Support them, which is not the same as solve, to offer support. But you might have some information that might be useful. And again, that's not solving, that's just giving information. Giving information about what other support might be available in the local area, or what other support you might have used that help you. Still not the same as telling them what to do. And then encourage them. And encourage them again to find qualified professional support that it rarely, unless by massive coincidence, is friends and family. It usually isn't. And even if it is, it's usually better off with a more independent view on that. So to try and distill down some of the things I've learned about spotting signs in myself, spotting signs in other people, what and when and how to look and so on. I've learned, for my own sanity and well-being now, that it's better for me to find a way to articulate what's in that snow globe than not. It's better for me to find a way to get it out. I do that a lot on LinkedIn, as some of you will definitely know. I use a bit of a journal almost. But for a time I did journal, just wrote it down. Wrote it out, it's better out than in. I've met other people who own dogs. And actually they walk their dog a lot and they talk to their dog a lot. And the dog is an absolutely fantastic listener. Offers no judgment. Might possibly sometimes do a poo in the middle of your telling, but it's not judging you. It just listens, and it's a way for people to express and articulate. And that's important for me anyway, because I've realised I actually don't know what I think about something until I've said it. And I wouldn't have done that before. I would only have articulated something until I was really, really clear on it before. And I was sort of missing a trick. It was the process of verbalisation that helped me get clarity and understand. But I was afraid to say things in case I've got it wrong or expose myself being silly, or just a lot of nonsense got in the way of me saying it. So I find ways, when I remember, to say things out loud. It doesn't have to be a human or a salient creature at all. It could be a lamppost. It could be anything. I've also discovered I don't necessarily need advice. I often do, of course, but not until I've said something out loud, not until I've fully understood it. And usually I need quite a lot of processing time to get there too. And I found this in other people too. Actually, most people are pretty smart. They know what will help. They just need help getting to it, getting the problem out. And this has been huge because I spent my entire adult life until 2019 actually deeply believing that I did have to figure out everything by myself and that there was merit and virtue in that. In being autonomous and independent and strong in the role that I was trying to play. And that meant don't ask for help, don't admit to weakness or fear or vulnerability, even at home where you're supposed to be at your safest. To the person who's supposed to love you the most, your wife or partner or whomever you live with. I wasn't even telling my wife because I felt like that wasn't what strength looked like. I now realise that asking for help is quite hard, therefore how can it be weak to do it? Still feels quite hard. It actually takes courage and strength to ask for help, not the inverse. So I had to sort of unlearn 30 odd years of habits. This is all well and good when we've created a nice calm space and focused and taken time and zoomed in, but the reality is after this, tomorrow, all the distractions of normal life are going to flood back in. And it could be the devices that we have in our pockets, the devices that we use for work. We invite in this chaos, unknowingly or not, with notifications that we switch on, forgetting that we can switch them off. So distraction gets in the way. That's part of life, I think. So I'm just going to explore. It's a bit of a tangent off spotting the signs, but it helps understand what's happening in your brain when you are under lots of duress. So I've ripped this straight out of the Microsoft Work Lab, I think it's called. This is from 2021. This has run around the internet a fair bit, but you might not have come across it. This is a representation when they wired up some people's brains. It was a control group, and they exposed Group A to back-to-back meetings, and Group B to the same style of meeting, but with breaks in it. And they measured what it did to people's brain waves. So what you're seeing on the left is 4 people that had no breaks, back-to-back meetings. Basically and simplistically, the redder the colour, the more stress is occurring within the brain. So it actually didn't matter what the meetings were. What mattered is that they were consecutive. And you ended up in meeting 3 in particular, more stressed than you were in meeting 1. You enter each successive meeting more stressed than you were. Immaterial of what the meeting's all about. Then they introduce a break, and your brain resets really quickly, and the breaks don't even have to be long. And we're back to time again, what we're doing with it. And this is how that graph plays out. So on the left, by the time you get to meeting 3 or 4, you're more stressed than the end of the previous meeting, which greatly impairs your ability to execute what it is that you're trying to do in that meeting. So back-to-back meetings might be good for looking productive, but they're actually really bad for productivity. We don't do good work. The breaks don't even have to be big. They just have to exist. And again, terrible slide with tons of words that you have to read. Poor presentation etiquette. I apologise. This just says some big sciencey words about what's going on in your frontal lobe when you put it under such prolonged, constant duress. It greatly impedes your ability to be focused and be engaged in the tasks at hand. If I was to say, what's your work ethic like? I expect most people would be able to come up with a pretty coherent and quite positive view of a work ethic, something that we've learnt and focused on and prioritise your work ethic. So this is quite new for me, because I think the absence of productivity in work used to equal something bad. Now recalibrated that, begun to understand that without rest you cannot perform. Professional athletes, as many of us definitely were, in our imaginations at least, know that to perform at a really high level, a sustainable period of time, you have to focus every bit on your recovery as you do in the performance itself. And yet we seem to have lost that, I suspect, in the typical way of working these days. There are no breaks. We're back to back. We're consistently late between each of these engagements, and we're not resting, eating, drinking, moving, not resting at all. And if we are resting, we're kidding ourselves it's a real rest. All we're doing is swapping one stimulus for another. I was on my laptop. I'm going to take a quick break. So I shall just replace one screen for the next. That's not a break. So let's assume we are going to focus on our rest ethic for a little while. A couple of pointers about that. Permission. I don't necessarily mean from your boss. I mean for yourself. Actually legitimately give yourself permission and prioritise it. Do it and persist at it. We formed a habit not to rest, so we can form one to rest and take breaks. Because if we don't do it, we're not going to find the time to ask one another how we are. We're not going to have the time to listen to the answer. We're not going to have the capacity to actually observe what we're seeing. We are impaired without breaks. In summary, nearly done. Thank you for so patiently giving me your attention. Better out than in. Whatever it is. Find a place for it to go. Friend, family, dog, lamppost, and if appropriate, a trained professional rather than a well-meaning pal. Have a little think about how and where and when you're resting. Don't let it go just because we're getting busier. That's unlikely to change. Take the time. Look after yourself. Ask and listen. It won't be created by itself. We're going to have to carve it out. Maybe you are the one that goes first in the people that you knock around with. My experience is someone will very shortly go second, and third and fourth and fifth and sixth, and all of a sudden we've got a new pattern. I would say that the nature of my relationship since I broke down at work has changed fairly significantly, for the better in almost all examples. Encourage professional help, go first, lead by example, and then finally just really smashing the point home. It's really hard to see stuff that you're not looking for. And not least, I suppose, here, of all places, I spent a long time thinking that I was the only one and that I was alone, only to discover I never was, I just didn't know it. I like this quote, read it the other day in a resilience book. I thought it was quite apt. That moment where you share an experience or a perspective. And where do such things happen? in places like this, if we choose to. Rugby clubs aren't famous for emotional sharing. They're not famous for vulnerability, which is weird because only 2 weeks ago I was naked with some of you people down the end. So we're comfortable with one flavour of vulnerability in a place like this, so why not another? So you play the game of who's in the picture now, but that's me. We're a bit younger then. So thank you for your attention. That will do for this chapter.